I'm a black actor on stage playing a Shakespearean role. How did I get here?
Shakespeare is a mirror for British cultural identity, its anxieties and ambitions. Who performs Shakespeare, when and how, helps define who we are as a community and how, collectively, we see ourselves changing. This project, funded by the AHRC, is an attempt, first of all, to tell an untold history. It's the history of Black and Asian performers working in Shakespeare in the UK.
This story has never been told. Not that it's been concealed, but it just hasn't been presented.
This is a project, I think, which more than anything else is driven by a desire for research to have impact in the community. What we've done is we've put together an introductory exhibition to map out the broad territory. It's divided into a number of panels. One deals with the 19th century with the great actor Ira Aldridge. The next with the most significant black performer of the 20th century in many ways, certainly the first half, that's Paul Robeson. Then we look at his heirs, people working in the footsteps of Robeson and very aware of their responsibility and their debt to him, looking at the 50s and 60s. Then, really decade by decade, we trace it through. And by doing that, it moves from a story of remarkable individuals to a general sense that the theatre is reflecting the changes in society. One of the biggest characters in this story is Paul Robeson. As a human being, Robeson is extraordinary. He's best known today as a singer. In the 1930s, he was equally well known as the only black film star in the world. He was also extraordinarily important because he was the first to claim Shakespearean roles for black performers. So in terms of subject matter and in terms of art, he opened the door, really, to the whole story that we're talking about. But he was simultaneously a political figure. He was involved with the Black liberation movement in Africa and became one of the leading figures in what was to become the civil rights movement. Unfortunately, he was also a communist, or a communist sympathizer, or a socialist, but it resulted in him becoming one of the main targets of McCarthyism, and specifically of J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. That resulted in his career being brought to almost a terminal stop in the 1950s. His passport was taken away from him. He couldn't travel abroad, though he had requests to sing, to act, even to appear in films around the world. Nonetheless, he kept going. He refused to become quiet. He refused to end his career. And in the late 1950s, his passport was returned to him, and he came to England and played Othello at Stratford in 1959.
I am told Othello was written for a white man to play. Othello is an Arab. In 19th century theatres, Othello was made light-skinned because Western Europe had made Africa a slave center. Our culture has survived long years of repression. My father was a slave.
Robeson was the first person to make the point that Shakespeare is a political writer and that Shakespeare's politics is still relevant today. A play about the situation of black people in contemporary society.
Shakespeare, the genius that he was, seemed to foreshadow and understand many of the problems that have since arisen in our world, perhaps were present then. Here is a part that has dignity for the Negro actor. Often we don't get those opportunities. Over the last 20 years or so that I've been in the profession, I've played a range of different parts, but Shakespeare has a special magic for me. When you're on stage speaking those beautiful words, really you feel like, ultimately like a communicator, like a true communicator. He has this way of understanding the human condition and of showing you yourself in practically everything he's done, whether he's talking about paupers or kings.
In the 1960s, actors began to appear at the Old Vic or at the Royal Shakespeare Company, but very, very few still, and under quite difficult circumstances. It's in the 70s that black actors begin to be assimilated into the entertainment industry at the classical level. And most of this story so far, up to the 1970s, is a story of Afro-Caribbean actors, or in some cases American or some with immediate African backgrounds. But then, after 1968, we're talking also about Asian actors. In the 80s, race was seen as a problem. And theatres like the RSC and the National tried several strategies, either by putting on all black performances of, for instance, Measure for Measure at the National in 1981, or by increasing token casting, gradually building up the significance of the roles that black actors were cast for. It's not until later in the 1980s that something very important happens, which is ethnic companies begin to emerge in their own right, such as Temba, Talawa, putting on black plays with black casts, or putting on the classics with black casts, laying claim to those parts, but demonstrating that black actors had talent and ability. That was the major point. Up until then, there'd been a sense of their being restricted. So in the 90s, on the basis of that, there's an explosion. Colorblind casting becomes taken for granted everywhere. Where we are now is another question, and that's one thing the project will address. We've got hip-hop Shakespeare with Akala, who trains people to develop their love of Shakespeare's language by developing their love of their own street language. We've got Yellow Earth, who are an Asian community company, performing King Lear in collaboration with actually an Asian theatre from China. This is Romeo and Juliet. Romeo, Juliet, and the nurse. They're the children of this story, but we want them to come with us into the next step by 2015. We've collected history, and now we're inviting people to help us out to discover some more.
We live in a large multicultural city with a significant rural area also attached to it. So actually exposing people to different views, to the great diversity of cultural expression that goes on in the UK is really quite important to us.
There are many individuals who've come before me. You know, it's a long line that stretches from Ira Aldridge through Paul Robeson, obviously in the 20th century, all the way through to actors today who are presenting Shakespeare, people like David Harewood and David Oyelowo, and people like that. So I think it's important that the legacy that they left behind is presented and celebrated. And I think also we need to make sense of what those experiences and those contributions have given us as a society.
Around the globe, things are changing. And as the black worker takes his place upon the stage of history, not for a bit part, but to play his full role with dignity in the very center of the action, a new day dawns.